Hello everybody and welcome back to the free online woodworking school where we aim to take your woodworking skills to the next level. In today's episode, we're going to get stuck in with some pre-sanding before gluing the cabinet together. Let's get going. Right, so this episode, the main objective here is to get this prepared for gluing, which we're going to be doing in the next episode. That means flushing off all joinery that we're not going to be able to get access to after it's glued together. It means pre-sanding inside faces because again, we're not going to be able to get access to them very easily after assembly. And it also means pre-arrasing some edges. Arrasing is basically taking the sharp corner off the edge of a component so it feels nice and soft to touch, but it still retains that sharp look to it, which is what we're going for with this cabinet. We don't want it looking like a big fluffy wooden cloud. So the first thing we're going to tackle here is flushing off joinery that's going to be inaccessible after gluing up. And you can see on this back dovetail here, we've got a tiny step on that shoulder line. Now that's likely down to the shim that I used to space the tail away from the back of the side panels, or it could also be the fact that I cut this rebate a little bit too deep. Could be either of them, but the fact of the matter is we need to get that flush. But after assembly, this rebate here is going to prevent us from getting a plane in there and planing this entire back surface flush. And if we look inside the drawer cavity, firstly, again, I've got some tiny steps on this back dovetail here, which I will need to plane down prior to assembly. And I need to check that the drawer runners here are indeed running flush, which they are, although there is a few adjustments that I could make to them in places. So the first thing I am going to do is get a knife and put a little mark on the dovetail component to show where it needs to be planed down to in order to be flush with the back of the rebate. Just in case that offset is uneven, that way I can then plane down to the 2 points, making sure it's a straight line between the 2 points, and that should be flush with the back panel. Right, so I've got it disassembled, and now I can put my knife into one of the points that I marked, and then line the ruler up with the other point that was marked on the opposite side, and then carefully knife a line between the two of them. Now, if this line looks to be parallel along the whole thing, you could also do this with a marking gauge if you fancied, but just in case there is any difference between the offset of this line and this line, I'm going to do it with a ruler because it makes it a bespoke fit. Same again with this one. I'll get the ruler planted on the shoulder near me and then get it lined up with the mark on the other shoulder line and carefully knife between them. Now it's just a case of planing down to those lines and making sure that it's both flat and square, ideally. And once again, we're looking for those little wispy bits to start breaking off on the edge, which will indicate when we are down to the line. There you go. So a few breaking off there now. I reckon one more pass. That should be absolutely fine. Of course, we'll quickly check it. Brilliant, that is bang on. And in the case of this one, where I'm pretty much bang on the line here, I can start, there you go, you can see those flaky bits breaking off now. Up here, I'm a little bit heavier, so we're just going to start the plane kind of back here and then do a short shaving, slightly elongate it, and then just work your way back. Check again. So it's breaking off all the way along there, breaking off there, and yeah, it's just about to on that side. So we'll do a few more. And when I'm referring to these little flaky bits breaking off, this is the material, or this was the material above the knife cut. So once you plane down to it, that becomes fragile and just breaks off. And what you're left with is this kind of raggedy looking corner. So that flat spot on the very edge of the timber is basically the other side of the knife line that's still in contact with the wood. And then that raggedy bit that runs along it is the bottom of the knife cut. And that's probably 1 or 2 passes to get rid of that. And then we know that we're bang on the line. So that's the dovetails at the back of the cabinet flushed off, and while we're focusing on the back of the cabinet, mine doesn't need any attention in this case, but yours may do. Ensure that the back of the shelf is sitting flush with the bottom of the rebate. If you're unable to bottom out the shelf in the groove and it's sticking out at the back, then that's going to cause a bump in the back panel, which isn't going to look too sightly from the inside. So ensure that you take off enough of the little tongue at the front of the shelf in order to shift it forward to make it flush with the bottom of the rebate. You'll also remember in the previous episode where we were cutting the shelf joinery that I intentionally left a little lip on the front of the shelf that can be planed off after it's glued up. This is easily accessible after the clamps have come off it, so there's no need to tend to that now. So coming back to this drawer cavity that I briefly mentioned earlier, just get a ruler in there and check that it's sitting flat. If this drawer runner is sitting proud into the cavity, then that's obviously going to cause a pinch point or something for the drawer to rock on when it's being used. So if there is something there, just simply take that component out, take a few skims off the top, reassemble it, and keep doing that until it gets perfectly flush. Alternatively, if the dovetail bit is sitting proud of the drawer runner, then you're going to run into a few more issues because you can't necessarily plane that flat, because doing so is going to affect the fit of the dovetail into the side panel here and basically either cause a gap under here or cause end grain to be proud. Neither of which is a huge issue because this is the bottom of the cabinet and it's going to be completely hidden, but for me I would suggest adjusting the little stub tenon joint that we cut in order to shimmy it up or down to make it flush. So it's almost time for the fun activity of pre-sanding, but before doing so there is one more thing I would like to do, and that is to drill holes through the top of these stretchers and countersink the inside so that after assembly we can easily screw through there to attach the top of the cabinet. This is so that obviously the screw heads are on the inside of the cabinet as opposed to driving through the top surface. Same again on the bottom of the cabinet. I'm going to pre-drill holes through here and then countersink the insides, and in order to tighten those screws I'm going to get a little L-shaped screwdriver in order to fit into there. However, if you can't be bothered to go out there and get one of those L-shaped screwdrivers, it's the bottom of the cabinet. You could just screw through the bottom of it into the stretchers below. Seeing as it's going to sit like that most of the time, you'll never see those screw heads anyway. Completely up to you. So here's those dovetail stretchers, and because these are the numbered faces, these are obviously the outside faces. If I drill through those, I may end up causing breakout on the other side, which is going to be the inside of the cabinet, i.e. potentially seen by the user of the cabinet. So we're going to flip these over and drill from the inside out, and if there's any breakout happening on this side, doesn't matter because either the top or the bottom of the cabinet is going to be sitting on it. But if you use a backing board, this shouldn't really be an issue. And I'm probably going to measure in about 25 millimeters from the bottom of the shoulder line, which should give me plenty of access to get in there with the screwdriver, while also being spread apart far enough to keep the top or bottom nice and secure. Now I'm going to drill these out on the drill press because I have one, but of course you could just do this with a normal hand drill. If it's a tiny bit out of plumb, then it's not the end of the world, don't worry too much about it. To attach the top of the cabinet, I'm going to be using a 4 by 25 millimeter screw, 4 millimeters referring to the width of the threads and 25 millimeters being the length of the overall screw. And I often find that a 2 millimeter or a 2.5 millimeter drill bit is perfect for drilling out pilot holes for a 4 millimeter wide screw. So that's what I'm going to be using here. Bear in mind that these pilot holes will be widened to clearance holes later in the project, but if you're not too sure what a clearance hole is or even a pilot hole, then all will be revealed later in the project when we actually come to attaching the top. But there will also be a diagram explaining everything below this video if you're watching this on the free online woodworking school. Speaking of which, if you're not watching this video on the free online school, there will be a little card popping up in the top corner now, which will take you directly to the page where you can view all the diagrams. And then just going to get them countersunk as well. And when you do this, make sure the head is going to go well below the surface of the timber, because 4 of these screw heads are effectively going to be within the drawer cavity and a drawer will be running over the top of them. Right, so the holes are piloted and countersunk, so now we don't have to faff around trying to do that while the cabinet is assembled and like trying to get in there with a cordless drill. Also, depending on where you were hoping to drill these holes, you may not actually be able to get a cordless drill close enough to the inside of the cabinet in order to drill that up. So it's well worth doing this before. Unfortunately, in swapping the camera angles around when I was at the drill press, I managed to countersink one of these on the wrong side, but at least the top's covering it. Perhaps I'll leave a little note next to it just in case anyone was to happen to take the top off at a later date, just saying, oops. But lesson learned, don't film yourself woodworking. See you later, guys. Now there is one other thing you could potentially do at this point if you wanted to. I'm not going to bother because I'm happy getting into the cabinet after it's assembled to do this particular task, but that task is cutting the hinge recesses on the front edge of the cabinet. After assembled, it's somewhat difficult to get chisels in there and doing it, but it is possible, and I'll be showing you that method later in the series. But if you don't want to mess around with that, then feel free to do that now. If you do want to do this now, the hinges would start 30mm down from the bottom shoulder of the dovetail and 30mm up from the top edge of the shelf. Just my personal preference, but completely up to you. So, pre-sanding these components, we're going to be attacking the inside faces and inside edges and all those things that we're going to find difficult to access to later on. Now, when I do this, I am going to be using a random orbit sander because I've got one, but this is because it's the most efficient way to do large panels like this. But if you happen to have a random orbit sander, which I'm aware a lot of you will, do not be tempted to try and sand the faces or edges of these thinner components. The reason is that random orbit sanders tend to have a soft base on them, and if you give it a squidge, you can usually feel there's a bit of give. If you put that over a thin edge, such as this, that sander is going to slightly dome over that surface and it's going to create a cambered surface on it, which isn't too noticeable when you do it on one edge, but then when you do it on all four, you end up with this horrible looking pillowed effect and you just lose all the detail on the components. A good rule of thumb when using a random orbit sander such as this is always keep at least 2/3 to maybe 3/4 of the disc on the material at all times. So if I was sanding this panel, the furthest I would go out is probably about here. That's overhanging by about 3/4 of the disc at the moment and shouldn't cause any substantial round over of that back corner. However, if I was to get that any closer, i.e. to about halfway, then it's going to start tipping and we're going to start losing that lovely detail on the back, and it'll just cause this weird pillowed inconsistent gap that just looks awful. So you can imagine the effect it has when you do it on a thin component like this, where it's rocking all over the place and you're taking off all those corners and it looks shocking. You know, even a smaller pad like this, which is a 5-inch pad, still you're going to have that problem. It's just going to rock all over the place and you're going to take off those corners. I'd say do these ones by hand. The side panels, perfectly fine to use a random orbit sander, whether you go for a 5-inch or a 6-inch disc, and also the shelf as well, perfectly possible to get on here with the random orbit sander. Just make sure that you've got roughly 3/4 to 2/3 of it in contact with the material at all times in order to prevent round over of any edges. Secondly, when attacking these faces with the random orbit sander or by hand, whichever method you happen to go for, avoid overdoing it around the joint areas of the shelf, of the dovetails, and also the sockets themselves. If you start sanding that area too much, then again it's going to start sort of dipping it away and you're going to start exposing gaps on shoulder lines and it's not going to look too good. So when you're working around the joint areas, just give them a quick scrub, but nothing too heavy in those areas. So because I'm working with ash here, which is a relatively open grains timber, I'm going to be starting with 120 grit on my random orbit sander and then jump up to 180 grit. That's probably as far as I'll need to go with this timber, because going any finer is probably a bit of a waste of time considering the rough open grain texture of this, and that would be the same if you were making this cabinet from oak, for example. However, if you're making it from walnut or maple, which are relatively close grain timbers, you could probably start off with 120, go to 180 and then jump up to 240, because that closer grained smooth surface will take a better finish off that finer grit, as opposed to a rough wood like this that's not going to make much of a difference. Right, so next the dovetail bits. So just a reminder, we're doing this inside face and the two outside edges as well. We're not going to bother with this outside face because we can get access to that after assembly, and we've got our markings on there as well and our unintentional countersink. Yes. So to sand these faces, a hard block is ideal. In this case, I've got a piece of plywood, but another piece of wood or something will be absolutely fine. Although they look fancy, sanding blocks like this, which have felt on the bottom, or even cork sanding blocks, will again slightly pillow over those edges, much like I described with the random orbit sander earlier, and it's going to create a rounded edge on there. A hard block like this can obviously not do that, and you get a really nice flat surface afterwards. Soft blocks like this are perfect for sanding larger panels, again much like the random orbit sander by hand, because that slight pillowing is going to conform to any bumps and stuff on this surface, whereas a hard block like this, it's going to be quite difficult to get into those very subtle dips in this surface, and you're going to have to get the whole thing flat before hitting them. So that's a quick bit of sanding block theory for you. Softer ones perfect for large flat surfaces, harder ones perfect for thin surfaces like this that you want to keep perfectly flat. So just need to make sure that you pull it nice and taut around the edge of the block. If it's not, then it's going to start pillowing around it. And if you can, stop before the shoulder line on the dovetails. Of course, you're going to accidentally go past it every now and then, but the less you do it, the better the fit's going to be. So after you're done sanding all the inside faces, just assemble the cabinet, double check that you have hit every surface. If not, mark it with a pencil and then you can easily see what you need to hit when you take it back to the vise. I'm pretty content that I've hit every face I need to, and everything's sanded up to 180 grit. Doesn't look like I've hit any of the joints too excessively, and all the shoulder lines are still closing up very nicely. So the final thing we need to do before assembling this cabinet is pre-arris all of the inside corners. Well, I say arris all of the inside corners. There are exceptions to this, and this can be quite a confusing part of the project, trying to work out which corners you need to take the edge off and which corners you need to leave a hard 90 degrees. Because in the case of the top stretchers, 3 of these internal corners are going to be exposed edges, which we want to take the corners off. However, the back one down here, where the back panel is going to be resting against it, you want to leave that as a hard 90-degree edge, because when the back panel's on there, firstly, no one's going to be able to interact with it and feel how sharp that edge is. And secondly, if you do round it off, then it's going to cause a little shadow gap between that stretcher and the back panel, which obviously we do not want. And as for the drawer cavity, by leaving these as hard 90-degree corners, they may interfere with the action of the drawer as it's being pulled out and pushed back in. So within this cavity, we're actually going to be doing some pretty heavy roundovers, because you're not going to see them, and by doing so, it's going to prevent any obstructions with the drawer. So to make this stage as clear as possible for those of you who are struggling to visualize which corners you actually need to take off, if you're watching this on the free online school, scroll down and you will see a full-on diagram that shows every corner you will need to take off within this cabinet. If you're watching this video on YouTube, however, you will not see this diagram, but by clicking the link in the description, it will take you straight to the page and all will be accessible from there. But let's go through these one by one anyway. So bottom corners of the front stretcher, we can take those corners off because those are going to be exposed and may, for whatever reason, be interacted with by the user. So I'm just going to put a tiny pencil mark on those corners. I'm not going to do any big scribble marks because I've just sanded these faces. Just 2 little pencil marks showing me that those corners need to be addressed. And then we got the back one here. So again, this front corner needs to be taken off, but the one at the back, that's where the back panel is going against it, so there is no point taking it off. As for the shelf, same again, no point taking off this back corner because the back panel is going to be resting against it, and taking that corner off is going to cause a shadow gap there, so we'll leave that one. So as for the drawer cavity, much the same. We're going to do a small arris on this front corner. You don't need to do too much there because there's going to be a drawer front there and you don't want to cause an excessive shadow gap. This one at the back, however, we want to do as a pretty heavy roundover. The reason for this is with the drawer, as it's going to be pulled out, we don't want the bottom corner of it catching on that hard edge there. Whereas if we do a slightly pillowed edge on it, then if for whatever reason that drawback was to catch it, at least it will slide over it very nicely. So heavy round over there, and we'll also do a heavy round over on this corner as well for the same reason as before. As the drawer is pushed in, we don't want it catching on a hard 90-degree edge here. We want to do a slight round over so that when it comes in, it should roll over any small corner that may be prominent there. Now, obviously, when you round over this corner and also this front corner here, you are going to cause a few gaps on the shoulder line of these drawer runners, but they're never going to be seen, and they're actually going to be left loose in there anyway, i.e. not glued. So in fact, what I'll actually end up doing with these for the same reason is round over the shoulders of the drawer runners as well, because again, any 90-degree edges on those may cause an obstruction. So to take these corners off, I can see my little pencil mark there, and I've got some 180 grit sandpaper wrapped around a hard block, and literally it's just going to be 1, 2 strokes, and that should be all we need to take off that corner while still giving it that nice crisp hard look. If you start scrubbing it, then the piece is going to look like a cloud in no time. So I've also got to do this back corner again, just 1, 2, sometimes just do a little bit again, and that is absolutely fine. And then another thing that I like to do that I think makes all the difference is get a piece of 240 grit sandpaper. This is quite thin sandpaper as opposed to this stuff, which is quite hard and rigid. And this stuff I just wrap around my thumb and I go up the edge once, and that makes a huge difference to it. It gets rid of any sort of 45-degree facet that was sanded on with the block and rounds over that corner even more so that it's incredibly nice to touch. Again, literally 240 grit, 1 stroke, done. So we're on the back one now. This one's only got 1 corner that I need to do. Remember, that back one has got the back panel going against it. So 1, lovely, and then 240 grit just to smooth out any small facets, and then I've just got some pencil marks to remove there as well. Right, so the bottom section, I can see I've got a little black line here which indicates that is the front edge, so let's just give that a quick once over, and 240, done. As for these internal edges, I mentioned that I want to do quite a heavy round over for those, and doing this with sandpaper will get the job done, but it's going to be a lot more effort than needed. So we're going to disassemble this, and I'll keep the components in the same orientation so that I don't mix things up. And I'm actually going to use a block plane to do this. Nice fine cut, and we'll just do a few passes with that and give it a relatively big round over. So at the moment I'm going in at 45 degrees, as you can see, but I'm going to start flattening it out so that it creates more of a ramp for that drawer to ride up. Then I go to the sandpaper and kind of blend that all in. And then the 240 grit. A couple of scrubs up and down should be all it needs. So if I pop that ruler on here, you can see exactly what I've tried to achieve by doing this. So 90% of the component is nice and flat across the top face, giving the drawer a nice reference surface to rest on. But that final 10% has been rounded off into a small ramp to prevent any of the drawer components catching on it as it's being operated. Same again on this other component. We'll start at 45 degrees. Take a few shavings like that just to establish the chamfer, and then as it grows we'll start flattening out the plane to create that ramped surface. Blend it all in slightly, and 240. As for the smaller components, I've got a tiny offcut of wood here with some 180 grit wrapped around it, and that'll be absolutely fine to just round off those top corners of the shoulders and create that small ramped surface. And I'll just finish it by blending it in with the grain. Maybe slightly dip off the edge or something like that. So you can see nothing violent going on, just a small dip between the two components is all you need to prevent anything catching. Right, and there you go guys, that is how you prepare the cabinet for a glue up. Now what I will say is some of the methods that I shared in this video are fairly unconventional and are not something that I would carry out on every project, particularly the heavy rounding of shoulders in a drawer cavity. It's not always called for, but in the past I have found it to be quite beneficial with the action of that drawer, but it's completely up to you. So as always guys, thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to press the like button, and you can move on to the next lesson by clicking the link below. And if you haven't already, please subscribe by pressing the big round button to the left hand side of the video. I'll see you in the next one.